So it's possibly the most famous letter in modern Jewish history, and it begins with 3 words: Dear Lord Rothschild.
A courier rides through the night in 1815, carrying a coded letter that will change history. This information network made the Rothschilds the richest people on Earth, but those same secret letters also carried warnings about their own children. They didn't just build banks, they built a closed circle that no outsider could ever enter. It's not that simple, though, because that closed circle eventually became a trap. While they were busy controlling the markets of London and Paris, their own biology was starting to revolt. The crazy part is how they tried to hide the results for over 100 years. Power shifting through the 5 arrows. The story of the Rothschild family does not begin with millions of dollars. It begins in a small, crowded house in the Jewish quarter of Frankfurt, Germany. Back in the late 1700s, a man named Mayor Amschel Rothschild was looking at the world and seeing a pattern of failure. He lived on a street only 12 feet, 3.6 meters, wide, surrounded by walls and gates that locked at night. Life was hard, and survival was the only thing that mattered. He did not rely on luck. Instead, he created a structure that was built for total survival. This is a key detail because it explains every single move they made for the next 2 centuries. He had 5 sons, and he saw them as the 5 fingers of a single hand. When they were old enough, he sent them to the most important cities in Europe. One went to London, one to Paris, one to Vienna, and one to Naples.
You are 5 brothers. I want you each to start a banking business in a different country. One to go and open a house in Paris, one in Vienna, one in London. Choose the most important centers.
The eldest son stayed in Frankfurt to keep the center strong. This was a brilliant move. By spreading out, they could control the finances of an entire continent. They were the first truly global business. While other banks only knew what was happening in their own city, the Rothschild brothers knew what was happening everywhere. They built a private network of couriers who traveled faster than the official post. These messengers carried letters written in secret codes that only the brothers could understand. If a war were starting in Italy, the brother in London knew about it before the king did. If a government in France needed a loan, the brother in Vienna was already preparing the terms. Hands down, this was the most effective information system in the world at that time. They weren't just moving money, they were moving knowledge. But here's the catch. To make this work, they had to be completely united. Mayor Amschel made his sons promise that they would never work against each other. National identity did not matter to them. A Rothschild in London was not an Englishman. A Rothschild in Paris was not a Frenchman. They were Rothschilds first, second, and third. On this level of internal unity was extremely rare. In most families, siblings fight over their inheritance, but these brothers shared everything. They coordinated their decisions and protected each other's interests as if they were all working in the same office. If one branch of the bank was struggling, the other 4 branches would send gold to support it. They were an unbreakable wall of financial power, and they moved hundreds of thousands of pounds of gold across borders during wars when no one else dared to travel. As their influence grew, they became the bankers to kings and emperors. They funded armies and built railroads across multiple countries. When the Napoleonic Wars reshaped the borders of Europe, the Rothschild Empire did more than just survive. It grew steadily while everyone else was losing their fortunes. They stayed in the shadows as much as possible, preferring to pull the strings from behind the curtain. But even with all this success, they were constantly watching for threats. They knew that their wealth made them targets. They also knew that the biggest threat to any dynasty is not an outside enemy, but internal division. They had seen other powerful families collapse because of bad marriages and messy disputes. They decided that they could not let that happen to them. The family assumed that markets would fail and governments would collapse. Because of this, they never kept all their assets in one place. They kept large reserves of gold available during unstable times. They avoided depending on any single ruler. If one country suffered, another part of their network was usually doing well. This was not luck. It was a cold, hard calculation, based on observing how other people failed. They treated wealth management as a science. And for a long time, the results were incredible. They owned tens of thousands of acres of land and built palaces that were hundreds of feet long. But as they looked toward the future, they realized that money could not fix everything. The most dangerous risks were moving much closer to home. Something deep inside their home was starting to change the way they viewed the future. Walls built against the world. As the Rothschild fortune reached levels that most people could not even imagine, the family leaders became very suspicious of outsiders. They noticed a specific pattern that kept happening to other wealthy dynasties. Money was rarely lost because of a bad business idea. It was lost because of people. When someone from outside the family married in, they brought their own opinions and their own relatives. These spouses often demanded influence over the business. They wanted to know the family secrets. According to records from that time, marriage was viewed as the fastest way for a strong family to become divided. The Rothschilds watched as other houses weakened from the inside because a daughter's loyalty shifted to her new husband, or a son trusted his wife's family with sensitive details. Private information was the lifeblood of the Rothschild bank. If a secret leaked, it could cost them millions of dollars in a single day. They could not afford to have sensitive business details become gossip at a dinner table. And they understood that wealth attracted attention, but marriage invited actual access. Once an outsider was part of the family, you could not just remove them. They were there to stay, and their interests might not be the same as the family's interests. This created a level of caution that bordered on paranoia. They studied the failures of other families as carefully as they studied the stock market. To them, an outside spouse was like a hole in a ship. It did not matter how small it was, and eventually it would let in enough water to sink everything. In the world of the Rothschilds, feelings were treated with a lot of suspicion. They did not dismiss love entirely, but they certainly did not trust it to run an empire. Emotions could change overnight. Loyalty could shift if a couple started fighting. They believed that people made decisions based on feelings that did not serve the long-term goals of the dynasty. Emotional bonds were seen as a very unstable foundation for a business meant to last for hundreds of years. Trust had to be guaranteed before it could be extended to anyone. To the Rothschilds, blood was the only thing that provided that guarantee. A family member shared the same history and the same pressure. They had everything to lose if the family failed. An outsider could just walk away. Because of this, family unity became a defense system. If there were disagreements, and they were handled in private rooms behind locked doors, they never let the public see any cracks in their armor. Decisions were always made with the idea that betrayal was possible, especially from someone who did not carry the Rothschild name. Even their most trusted business partners were never given full access to the inner workings of the family network. They were kept at a distance, given only the information they needed to do their jobs. The real power stayed within a very small, and very private group of people who all shared the same DNA. They controlled estates that covered thousands of acres, thousands of hectares, and kept their gates closed to everyone but their own. Marriage slowly stopped being a personal choice and became a corporate strategy. Choosing a partner was a family concern with massive consequences. A single bad union could weaken decades of careful planning and put the entire fortune at risk. They did not reach this conclusion quickly. It was a gradual change, shaped by watching everyone around them fail. As their wealth increased, the stakes became even higher. A mistake that might just be a minor problem for another family would be a disaster for them. They decided that the only way to be truly safe was to stop looking outside for partners. Keeping the world out meant they had to start looking at their own relatives for spouses. Keeping the fortune under one name. Once the family leaders decided that outsiders were too dangerous, they took a very drastic step. Marriage began to turn inward. At first, it was subtle. Maybe a cousin would marry another cousin once in a while. But soon, it became the standard rule for the entire family. For several generations, the vast majority of Rothschild marriages were between close relatives. Specifically, many of these unions were between first cousins. In some cases, uncles even married their own nieces. Inside the family, this was not seen as strange or wrong. It was seen as the most practical way to keep the bank secure. They were folding the family tree back in on itself to make sure the money never left their hands. They were trying to build a wall out of their own blood. This repetition was very deliberate. If you look at their family tree from the 1800s, the same names appear over and over again. A son would marry the daughter of his father's brother, and this meant that the dowry stayed in the family. The inheritance was never divided between different houses. From a business perspective, this was incredibly efficient. It allowed them to keep their wealth concentrated in a way that no other family in Europe could match. They did not want to form alliances with other powerful families, because that would mean sharing control. They wanted total control, and the only way to get that was to keep the bloodline pure and the circle closed. In one generation, almost all the marriages followed this internal pattern. According to economic historians, this strategy worked perfectly for the bank. There were no major public feuds or messy inheritance battles that ruined the business. Money moved smoothly from one generation to the next without any outside claims. They managed to keep their fortune together for much longer than any of their competitors. From the outside, the dynasty looked like a machine that never broke down. The newspapers reported on their massive success and their beautiful estates that were bigger than some small towns. They did not report on the private arrangements of the family. The public saw a single, united face that never showed any sign of weakness. But some people who watched the family closely found this unity a bit unsettling. It felt unnatural to see a family that never had public arguments or scandals. Their personal lives were guarded more closely than the gold in their vaults. Children grew up in a world where their relatives were also their future business partners and their future spouses. Marriage discussions started early and were treated with the same seriousness as a major government loan. Personal preferences were usually secondary to the needs of the family. The system was so successful at protecting the wealth that it reinforced the idea that this was the right way to live. They lived in mansions with walls 10 feet, 3 meters, high to keep their secrets safe. Each generation that passed without a financial disaster made them more certain of their strategy. The fear of outsiders became a hard rule that no one was allowed to break. Keeping the circle closed was not just the safe thing to do, it was the proven thing to do. However, this growing certainty came with a hidden cost that no one wanted to talk about. It was not written down in the bank ledgers, and it was never mentioned in the social pages of the newspapers. But it was there, moving quietly through the generations, waiting for the right moment to surface. The gold was safe, but the health of the family was starting to pay a heavy price. Reality hitting the marble halls. When the inner circle of the family became very tight, some very quiet warning signs started to appear. These issues did not show up in the business news or public announcements. Instead, they were hidden in private letters and notes shared between close family members. In these secret documents, some relatives were described as being fragile or overwhelmed. The language they used was very careful. They never said exactly what was wrong. They used soft words to describe people who were clearly struggling with their mental health. It was as if naming the problem directly would make the family look weak, and that was something they could never allow. And they had reputations to protect across thousands of miles, thousands of kilometers. Doctors were brought in, but their job was very specific. They had to be discreet above all else. In those days, powerful families did not want clear medical diagnoses. They wanted broad explanations that sounded professional but did not reveal too much. Medical records from that period often use phrases like nervous strain or temporary exhaustion. This allowed the family to treat the person without having to admit that there was a serious problem in the bloodline. Many people believe this was done to protect the family's reputation and keep the public from wondering if the Rothschilds were losing their edge. The doctors were paid thousands of dollars to keep their mouths shut and their notes vague. When a family member's behavior became too difficult to hide, the solution was always distance. They were encouraged to step away from their roles in the business or the social world. The public was told that they needed rest or a change of environment. This usually meant traveling to a quiet estate in the country or a secluded location in a different country. Once someone left under these conditions, the family stopped talking about them. It was a very effective way to manage a problem without having to explain it. In some cases, people who were very famous in the business world suddenly vanished from the records. Their positions were filled, the company kept moving, and their names eventually faded away. This pattern of silence repeated over and over again. If you look at the family letters, you can see people being gradually written out of the story. It did not mean they were gone forever, it just meant they were no longer visible. The family had an organized way of handling this. They kept private doctors on the payroll who were always available and always silent. They avoided public hospitals at all costs. Everything was handled in private homes or secret facilities where no one could ask questions. The goal was to fix the issue without creating a public record that could be used against them later. They kept their relatives in rooms that were hundreds of square feet, dozens of square meters, with every luxury, but no one was allowed to visit. This approach was not illegal, but it was very selective. They kept their family matters out of the legal system and the government reports. There were no formal admissions to institutions. What would have been a public record for any other family remained a private arrangement for the Rothschilds. Absence became the only answer to the public's curiosity. If someone was gone, they were gone, and the story did not change. But inside the family, the same problems kept returning. They were seeing a pattern that was becoming harder and harder to ignore as the years went by. The secret was getting out, and they could no longer pretend it was just a coincidence. Understanding the price of power. By the time the family reached the 20th century, the pattern was impossible to deny. This was not a series of isolated cases of stress or bad luck, but a structural collapse of the biological foundation upon which their empire was built. The same issues were appearing repeatedly in the same bloodlines, suggesting that the very strategy used to consolidate their wealth, intermarriage, was the primary catalyst for their physical and mental decline. When you look at the private medical notes across several generations, you see that these conditions did not just show up once and go away. They returned in different family members at different times, manifesting with a consistency that mirrored the movement of their capital. In some branches of the tree, the issues surfaced in almost every generation, serving as a biological tax on their accumulated power. This was a clear sign that the problem was inherited, a predictable consequence of a gene pool that had become increasingly shallow. The cost of marrying within the family for 200 years had finally become visible, revealing a paradox. They had managed millions of dollars with surgical precision, but they could not manage the basic instructions written into their own cells. They had protected their money and their power by closing the circle, ensuring that no outsider could dilute the family's influence or claim a share of the profits. However, in doing so, they had also trapped the same genetic vulnerabilities inside that circle, allowing recessive traits to find matches and express themselves with devastating frequency. The illnesses were not random occurrences, and they followed the family lines exactly, appearing like ink stains on a map of their genealogy. Money could hide the symptoms from the public through the hiring of private doctors and the acquisition of secluded estates, but it could not change the DNA that was being passed down to the children. The family could give a child the best care in the world, providing access to the finest specialists and the most advanced treatments of the era, but they could not stop the inheritance of mental fragility. This was a very uncomfortable truth for a family that prided itself on being in total control of every variable in their environment. They could move gold across 500 miles in a single day through a sophisticated network of couriers and credits, yet they remained powerless to fix a single strand of DNA that dictated the quality of their internal lives. The darkest secret of the Rothschilds was not an evil plan or a hidden room filled with illicit documents. It was simply a biological vulnerability that no amount of compound interest could erase. Mental health struggles became an integral part of the Rothschild bloodline, passed down alongside the banks and the mansions. The very traits that made them so successful, the intense focus, the discipline, and the obsessive attention to detail, were now linked to something they could not manage, and their characteristic drive appeared to be a double-edged sword. The same neurological wiring that allowed for financial genius also seemed to predispose certain members to profound instability. Control had saved their empire during wars and market crashes, but it had also concentrated their genetic risks. Each marriage between cousins reduced the outside influence and increased the sameness of their DNA, a process known as homozygosity, which effectively stripped away the biological defenses that a more diverse genetic makeup would have provided. Over time, that sameness led to predictable instability behind closed doors, creating a hidden history of suffering that stood in stark contrast to their public image of invincibility. They spent millions of dollars on private care to keep the truth from leaking out to the newspapers, maintaining a facade of perfect health while the internal reality was increasingly fractured. The pattern finally became impossible to hide when it affected a family member named Liberty Rothschild. She was born into a world of extreme wealth and high expectations, an environment where the Rothschild name carried the weight of historical destiny. She was described as a very intelligent and sensitive girl, possessing the intellectual sharpness that the family prized. But as she grew up, it became clear that her life would not be the same as the others. The onset of her symptoms was not a gradual decline, but a sharp break from the path of her peers. She was eventually diagnosed with schizophrenia, a diagnosis that shattered the family's ability to categorize the issue as mere nervous strain or temporary exhaustion. This was a serious, long-term condition that required constant care and a complete rethinking of how the family handled its internal crises. The family supported her and made sure she was safe within the confines of their vast resources, but she was completely removed from public life, becoming a ghost within the very system she was born to inherit. Her experience showed that the old system of hiding and ignoring the problem had reached its functional limit. The silence that had protected the family's reputation for a century was no longer an adequate defense against a clinical reality that demanded recognition. However, another family member named Miriam Rothschild decided to take a completely different path, one driven by the same analytical rigor the family usually applied to balance sheets. She was a scientist who understood biology and inheritance not as a source of shame, but as a field of study governed by observable laws. She saw what was happening across the different branches of the family, and realized that science was the only real answer to a problem that money had failed to solve. In the 1960s, she did something that shocked the family and broke the long-standing code of silence. She publicly funded research into schizophrenia and attached her name to it. This was a massive change in the family's internal culture. For the first time, a Rothschild was openly connecting the family name to a hereditary mental illness, treating the condition as a biological fact rather than a moral failing or a reputation-damaging secret. Miriam's approach was a rejection of the Victorian era's preference for euphemisms. She wanted to understand the causes of the condition instead of just hiding the results behind high walls and expensive nurses. She believed that the only way to help future generations was to face the truth about their genetics, applying the family's characteristic persistence to the task of scientific discovery. By establishing the Schizophrenia Research Fund, she transitioned the family from being passive victims of their own biology to being active participants in the search for a cure. She recognized that the concentration of wealth had led to a concentration of specific genetic markers, and that only through transparent, rigorous research could the cycle be understood or eventually broken. Her work marked the end of an era where biology was ignored in favor of lineage, proving that while wealth can build a fortress, it cannot protect the inhabitants from the vulnerabilities of the human body. The story of the Rothschilds in the 20th century thus became a narrative of transition. From the hubris of thinking they could control everything, to the humility of accepting their own biological limitations. It makes you wonder, is it possible to truly own the world if you cannot even control what lives inside your own blood? The Rothschilds survived wars and crashes, but their biggest battle was always against their own reflection. Let me know what you think in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories.